Chapter 10 of England and the 100 Years' War by Charles William Chadwick Oman. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Pamela Nagami. Henry V, 1413 to 1422. The succession of Henry of Monmouth to his father's throne greatly strengthened the position of the House of Lancaster. The new king had gained the crown by quiet inheritance, not by armed force, and he was not responsible for the cruel death of Richard II and the other crimes by which Henry IV had climbed to power. Nor was he the man to imperil the position which he had obtained. He had been working hard both as a warrior and an administrator since his early boyhood, and had received such a training as fell to the lot of none of his predecessors since Edward I. Though courteous and even-tempered, Henry could be stern on occasion. He was just according to his lights, but there can be no doubt that his views were often narrow and purely legal. His rigidly orthodox piety left no room in his heart for mercy to heretics. His most unjustifiable renewal of the French war and his persecution of the Lollards mark the unsympathetic side of his character. But he was well loved by the majority of his subjects, a ruler, able, orderly, and conscientious, with a strong hand and an infinite capacity for work, was a great boon to the nation. Henry's first acts after his accession were wise and graceful. He released the young Earl of March and restored him to his estates, though there was obviously some danger in setting at liberty a possible rival. He gave back the earldom of Nottingham to John Mowbray, brother of the Thomas Mowbray who had fallen with Scroop in 1405. He brought the body of Richard II to London and had it interred in state beside that of his wife, the good Queen Anne. But soon after, Henry showed that one section of his subjects must expect no favour from him. He authorized Archbishop Arundel to proceed with greater vigour against the unfortunate Lollards. The most noted member of the sect was now Sir John Oldcastle, Lord Cobham, who had been an able and trusted lieutenant of the king during the Welsh wars. Oldcastle, when brought to trial, made a vigorous defence, denouncing the efficacy of penances and pilgrimages, the worship of images, the ambition and ill-living of the Pope, and the greed of the friars. He was pronounced a heretic and sent back to the Tower, but escaped from it before the day fixed for his execution. It seems that, in despair for their future, some of the Lollards now engaged in a plot to seize the king's person and force him to take Oldcastle as his chief minister. It was their design to muster armed men in St. Martin's Fields by night and make a sudden dash at the palace of Westminster. But the design was betrayed, and Henry, occupying the trysting-place beforehand, caught or scattered each band as it arrived. Nearly 60 Lollards were executed, the chief being a knight named Sir John Acton. But Oldcastle got away and hid himself on the Welsh border. It was not till some years later that he was captured and executed as both heretic and traitor. When once firmly set upon his throne, King Henry proceeded to turn his attention to foreign politics. Like many other sovereigns in different epochs, he had formed the conclusion that the panacea for internal disorders is a successful war abroad. Nothing would strengthen the House of Lancaster more than a vigorous resumption of the old attacks on France, if only they could be carried to a fortunate conclusion. The state of affairs across the Channel seemed to promise an easy task for the invader. The Burgundian and Armagnac factions were waging open war upon each other throughout the land. The king was a hopeless lunatic. His son, the Dauphin Louis, was a dissipated lad of 17, who had estranged half the people of the land by becoming a hot partisan of the Armagnacs. The prospect of a war with England was regarded with dismay by the French, and when Henry began to tamper with the Burgundians and to speak of renewing the old claims of Edward III, the Dauphin's advisers seemed almost panic-stricken. Before a blow had been struck, they offered the King of England the hand of the Princess Catherine with a dowry of 800,000 crowns, and undertook to restore to him all those parts of Guienne and Gascony which had been lost by England since 1370. The Duchy of Aquitaine, as constituted by the Treaty of Bretigny, would have been brought back into being, save that Poitou and Saintonge were to remain French. But Henry was bent on war for war's sake, and had no intention of accepting these liberal offers. In 1415, after many months of negotiation, he broke off all relations with France and began to make preparations for invading Normandy. No language can be too strong to use in the condemnation of his greed and ambition. For the political gain of the moment, he condemned England and France to 40 years of misery, and set on foot a war which was to prove the ruin of his own house. In the summer of 1415 the army of invasion was mustered at Southampton. It was admirably equipped and composed of picked men, but its numbers were not large. Only 2,500 men-at-arms and 7,000 archers were assembled. They took with them the largest train of artillery that England had yet seen. The host was on the eve of sailing when the kingdom was startled by the news that a dangerous conspiracy against the king's life had been discovered. It had been formed by Richard of York, Earl of Cambridge, the king's cousin. He had married the sister of the Earl of March, and had planned to place his brother-in-law on the throne and rule under his name. March himself, a harmless and unenterprising young man, had no part in the plot. The chief accomplices of Cambridge were Lord Scroop, a kinsman of the Archbishop who had been executed in 1405, and Sir Thomas Grey. They kept their counsel so ill that the king got wind of their designs and arrested them before they were ready to strike. Full proof of their treason being produced, all three were executed, 5th of August, 1415. This plot was a purely dynastic business, the legitimate continuation of the many movements in favour of the House of March which had disturbed the reign of Henry IV. In the middle of August the army crossed the Channel and landed near Harfleur, to which it laid siege. The place made a gallant resistance, but received no help from without, though the Dauphin had mustered a large army at Rouen. The English suffered more from the summer heat and from camp fever than from the missiles of their enemies. After a siege of 5 weeks, the artillery of the besiegers had so shaken the walls that the garrison surrendered, September 22nd, 1415. A good foothold in Normandy had been secured, but meanwhile the season was growing late and the army was dwindling away. When 1,200 men had been told off to garrison Harfleur, and the numerous sick and wounded had been sent back to England, only 1,000 men-at-arms and 4,000 archers remained available for service in the field. This body was too small for a march on Paris or a serious attempt to subdue Normandy, and the king resolved to lead them across to Calais and not to advance deeper into France. Such a movement was rather a defiance of the Dauphin and his host than a serious military movement. It would have been better to bring home the army by sea, for the march placed it in grave peril of destruction. King Henry crossed Normandy and Picardy till he came to the Somme, which proved as great a barrier to him as it had been to Edward III in 1346. He was only able to cross it by striking inland as far as Péronne, and while he was making this detour the French army, now commanded by Jean d'Albret, the Constable of France, outmarched him and threw itself across his path. Close by the village of Agincourt, the English found the way to Calais blocked by a host of 6 to 8 times their own numbers. It was necessary at all costs to force a passage through them, for the weather had been bad, the army was worn out by long marches, and the provisions were almost exhausted. Accordingly, Henry drew out his little force and offered battle between the villages of Agincourt and Tramcourt, October 25th, 1415. He ranged his handful of men-at-arms in 3 small bodies, each flanked by 2 wings of archers, and waited to be attacked. The ground between him and the French was rain-sodden, ploughed fields, by no means easy to cross, when the knightly armour had grown so heavy that it was no longer a simple matter to march in it. The French, despising the small numbers of their enemies, thought that an easy victory was in their hands. They sent before them, as at Poitiers, 2 squadrons of mounted men, who were to break in upon the flanks and rout the archers, while the main body followed on foot in 3 dense lines, each larger than the whole English army. 25th of October, 1415. The cavalry in advance struggled through the heavy ground till they came in range of the archery, when they were shot down almost to a man without striking a blow. The masses of dismounted knights lurched heavily on in their wake, but were brought to a stand by their fatigue and by the deep clay in which they sank almost to their knees. They halted in exhaustion some distance in front of the English line. Seeing their plight, King Henry made his men advance, and pausing at a convenient distance from the mass, bade his bowmen let fly into it for some minutes, and then to close. The French line of battle, already riddled by the arrow shower, was easily routed by the impact of the charge. The knights were rolled helplessly into heaps, and slain or made prisoners by the lightly armed bowmen, who proved far more effective than the men-at-arms on such ground. The moment that the first line was disposed of, Henry pushed on against the second, which made a somewhat better resistance, but was finally broken up and slaughtered like the first. The third line melted from the field without fighting, save a few of its chiefs, who refused to fly and went forward to certain death. While they were being disposed of, an alarm was raised that the English camp was being attacked from the rear, and the king ordered his men to slay their captives and turn back for a new fight. But the diversion was caused only by bands of marauders, who fled when they saw the king moving upon them, so that the slaughter of the prisoners, which had been begun, proved wholly unnecessary and was stopped. When the field was searched by the victors, they found among the slain the constable and 3 dukes, Brabant, Bar, and Alençon, with 7 counts, 90 barons, and 5,000 or 6,000 men-at-arms, numbers greater than those of the whole English army. 1,500 prisoners of rank still survived, among them the young Duke of Orleans and the Counts of Vendôme, Eu, and Richemont. The English loss was trifling, though 2 great peers had fallen, Edmund, Duke of York, and Michael, Earl of Suffolk. Only 13 men-at-arms and 100 archers had perished with them. The heavy armour of the French seems to have been as fatal to their power of striking effective blows as to their ability to move in the sodden ploughland. The arrows pierced their mail with ease, while in close fighting they seem to have been at an equal disadvantage, and were dashed down helplessly by the axes and maces wielded by the bare arms of the archers. The victory seemed to justify Henry's rash march across France, and in the actual fighting his tactical skill had been as evident as his personal courage. But if the French had been commanded by a cautious and capable general, it is hard to see how he could have escaped a disastrous defeat. Henry's army was so small and so exhausted that he could make no immediate use of the victory, and was obliged to march on to Calais and thence take ship to London. He was received with a splendid triumphal procession, but his victory had been more showy than fruitful, and the possession of Harfleur was the only tangible benefit which had resulted from his campaign. The Armagnac party had not been crushed, even by the carnage at Agincourt, and there was some fear that the Burgundians might be driven into opposing England by a tardy revival of patriotic spirit. Harfleur was beset by the French for the whole of the next year, and had a narrow escape of falling back into their hands. For the greater part of 1416, Henry was busied with negotiations with the Emperor Sigismund, who visited England full of great plans for restoring peace to Christendom by putting an end to the great schism which had been rending the Church in twain since 1378. Henry gladly lent himself to this scheme, which had taken shape at the Council of Constance. 2 popes having been deposed and a third forced to resign, a universally acknowledged pontiff was secured in the person of Martin V, 1417. But the council is better remembered for the burning of John Huss, the great Bohemian reformer, and the spiritual heir of Wycliffe, than for its abortive attempt to reform the debased papacy. In return for Henry's assistance in matters ecclesiastical, Sigismund endeavoured to negotiate a peace with France on terms favourable to England. But the Armagnacs would not listen to the exorbitant claims of the victor of Agincourt, and the Burgundian duke held aloof, willing to profit by his enemy's misfortunes, but afraid to offend the national spirit of France by an open alliance with England. The war had therefore to continue. Raising an army of about the same size as that of 1415, the king crossed the sea in August 1417 and began to overrun Normandy. This time he came not to execute a plundering raid, but to conquer the land piecemeal. One after another he took Caen, Lisieux, Bayeux, Alençon, and Mortagne, cutting a huge cantle out of the duchy, in which he established a solid base for further operations. The Armagnacs and Burgundians were fighting hard round Paris and paid no attention to the invader. In the next year he steadily pushed his sphere of operations to right and left, conquering Saint-Lô, Coutances, and Cherbourg in the west, and then turning east to lay siege to the great city of Rouen. He kept stern discipline among his troops and gave such good government to the conquered districts that it contrasted strongly with the anarchy which had prevailed before. Meanwhile the struggle at Paris had ended in success for the Duke of Burgundy. The populace had risen against his rivals, massacred the Constable Armagnac with many of his party, and driven the rest away. The Duke became by his victory responsible for the conduct of the war with England, but showed himself as incapable as the Constable had been of checking King Henry. By allowing the gallant defenders of Rouen to remain unsuccoured for 6 months, he drew upon himself the condemnation of every patriotic Frenchman. In January 1419 the Norman capital fell, reduced by sheer famine, and Henry entered its gates. Then at last did John of Burgundy begin to stir, but it was not in order to raise against the English the whole force of France, but to make one last attempt to buy them off by offering more liberal terms than the Armagnacs had offered. But a conference at Meulon, May 1419, revealed that Henry's terms were as exorbitant as ever. He asked for all the lands granted to Edward III by the Treaty of Bretigny, and the whole duchy of Normandy, as well as for the arrears of King John's long unpaid ransom money of 1360. In despair at the arrogant demands of the English king, Burgundy resolved to make peace with the Armagnac faction, and unite with them for a last desperate attempt to expel the invader. His enemies were now headed by Charles, the youngest son of the mad king, who had become Dauphin on the death of his elder brothers. They professed their readiness to come to terms with the Burgundians, but when the two princes met in conference on the bridge of Montereau, 10th of September 1419, the Dauphin's attendants treacherously fell upon the Duke and hewed him down as he knelt before his cousin. This brutal and senseless murder had the natural result. The Duke's young son, Philip, and all the partisans of Burgundy at once went over to the English side and swore that Charles would never reign over France. Rather than acknowledge the murderer as heir to the throne, they would accept Henry's ill-founded claim and take him as their ruler. All the cities of northern France where the Burgundians were strong thus became friendly to the English and opened their gates to the invader. On May 20th, 1420, Henry entered Troyes with the young Duke Philip at his right hand, and there met the Queen of France, her insane spouse, and her daughter Catherine, whose hand had been offered to him as far back as 1414. The unfortunate Charles VI was made to give his consent to a treaty by which he made Henry regent of France, and gave him the right of succession to the throne on his own death, to the exclusion of the Dauphin. On June 2nd the English king married the Princess Catherine, in order to give himself some better claim to the crown than the mad king's bequest. After turning his arms against those towns in the neighbourhood which still held out for the Armagnacs, and reducing them, Henry brought his bride and his father-in-law to Paris, where he celebrated his Christmas festivities in great state. Early in the spring he returned to England and made a progress through the whole land with his wife, to receive the homage and congratulations of his admiring subjects. No king of England had ever wrought such feats of arms, and it seemed that he had carried to a successful end the great war which had cost his predecessors so much fruitless expense of life and wealth. Parliament ratified all the provisions of the Treaty of Troyes with alacrity, not noting, we may suspect, the danger which accompanied it, that England might ere long become a mere province of France, for the greater ever draws the less. But it was not long before a jarring note was struck to mar the universal harmony. In April 1422, news came to England of a disaster on the Loire. The king had sent his eldest brother, Thomas, Duke of Clarence, to chase the Dauphinois out of Anjou and Maine, but the enemy had received a large reinforcement from Scotland under the Earl of Buchan, and for the first time since Agincourt turned to fight in the open. Recklessly pursuing with his archers far to the rear, Clarence ran into an ambush at Beaugé, March 21st, 1422, and was there surrounded and slain. His companions, the Earls of Somerset and Huntingdon, were taken prisoners. The news of this defeat soon drew the king back to France, June of 1422. He marched south and drove the Dauphinois back to Orleans and beyond the Loire. Then he turned to reduce their few remaining strongholds in central France. None of them gave him much trouble save Meaux, whose garrison made a resistance of unparalleled obstinacy. Henry formed the siege in October, and the town did not yield till May. All through the winter of perpetual rain he lay before its walls, obstinately refusing to draw back from his flooded trenches. He and his army were smitten with a terrible plague of ague and dysentery, which thinned his ranks even faster than starvation diminished those of the garrison. When spring came, the town yielded, and Henry, showing the stern cruelty which not unfrequently disfigured his action, hung the governor and 4 of his companions. He then turned back toward Paris, and ere long his wife and the infant son whom she had lately borne him rejoined him. But men saw that he was no longer himself. The hand of death was upon him, for the chills of his winter camp had stricken him with an exhaustion from which he could not rally. He took to his bed in the castle of Vincennes near Paris, and lingering in a state of utter prostration through the summer heat, died on August 31st, 1422, leaving all his great conquests to a weakly child of less than a year old. End of chapter 10. Chapter 11 of England and the 100 Years' War by Charles William Chadwick Oman. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Pamela Nagami. Henry VI, the Minority and the French War, 1422 to 1450. The death of Henry V was followed in a few weeks by that of his imbecile father-in-law, Charles VI, October 21st. Thus the crowns of England and France both fell, according to the provisions of the Treaty of Troyes, to the sickly child Henry of Windsor. It might have been expected that the domination of the English across the Channel would disappear when the strong personality of the conqueror was removed, and the power which he had wielded passed into many hands. But the Dauphin Charles, the King of Bourges, as men now called him, was both unpopular and apathetic. His councillors and captains were incapable, and they could make no profit out of the opportunity which was offered them. As long as the young Duke of Burgundy remembered his father's murder and remained the ally of the English, the Nationalist party was unable to make any head against the invaders. Henry V had left 2 surviving brothers. John, Duke of Bedford, the elder of the pair, was made Regent of France, an office which he discharged with great energy and ability, doing his best to carry on the war with very inadequate resources, and conciliating Philip of Burgundy to the best of his power. To bind him yet more closely to the English alliance, John wedded the Duke's sister, the Princess Anne. Humphrey of Gloucester was a very different character from his steady and hard-working brother. He was flighty, petulant, quarrelsome, and selfish, though his affable manners, his patronage of learned men, and his cultivation of all the arts of popularity won him the name of the good Duke Humphrey from his numerous partisans. Gloucester had been regent of England at his brother's death, but the Lords of the Council and the Parliament feared his reckless ambition so much that they would only allow him to continue in power under many restrictions. Instead of regent, they made him only protector of the realm and the king's chief counsellor, and he was to act in all things with the consent of a council of regency composed of 15 members. The chief opponent of the Duke was his half-uncle Henry Beaufort, Bishop of Winchester, an able and obstinate man who thoroughly distrusted his nephew. The majority of the council generally backed the bishop, and Gloucester spent much of his time in fruitless bickerings with them. It is most astonishing to find that the death of Henry V was not followed by any shrinkage of the English possessions in northern France. On the contrary, the area of the region which acknowledged his little son as king continued slowly to increase for more than 6 years. Bedford was zealous and untiring in his exertions, and though help was doled out to him from England with a very sparing hand, he contrived to keep up the war, to a great extent by the use of French money and French mercenaries. Twice the Dauphinois strove to break into the provinces of the English obedience, but they suffered 2 bloody defeats at Cravon, July 31st, 1423, and Verneuil, August 17th, 1424. In the second of these fights fell the Earl of Douglas and nearly all the Dauphin's Scottish auxiliaries. Further aid from Scotland was hard to get, for the English government had just released and restored to his kingdom the long-imprisoned King James I. That prince had married an English wife, Joan Beaufort, the bishop's niece, and adopted a policy of consistent friendliness to his southern neighbours. The first danger to the English dominion in France came from a freak of Humphrey of Gloucester. He provoked the Duke of Burgundy to great wrath by marrying Philip's cousin, Jacqueline, Countess of Holland and Hainault, who had absconded from her lawful husband, the Duke of Brabant. Obtaining for her a divorce of more than doubtful validity from the anti-pope, Benedict XIII., the Duke wedded her and tried to make himself master of her heritage in Hainault. Burgundy had no desire to see Gloucester established as a neighbour of his county of Flanders, and joined John of Brabant in overrunning Hainault. He might even have broken away from the English alliance if he had not been turned aside by the soft words of his brother-in-law Bedford. Gloucester meanwhile proved himself an indifferent champion of his wife's claims. He fled back to England, while she fell into the hands of Duke Philip and was thrown into prison. Instead of pursuing the quarrel further, Humphrey very meanly acknowledged that his marriage had been invalid, and consoled himself by marrying Eleanor Cobham, a Kentish lady who had taken his fickle fancy, 1427. After escaping the dangers to which his reckless brother's conduct had exposed him, Bedford was ere long to be confronted by a far more formidable difficulty. Slowly pushing his operations southward, he arrived at the gates of Orleans, the last French stronghold north of the Loire. To besiege this important strategical point, the whole available field army of the Regent was sent forward under the Earl of Salisbury, the son of Richard II's Lollard friend. So limited, however, were the resources of the English that the expedition did not exceed 4,000 men. Yet weak as was the attack, the defence was weaker still, and Salisbury was able to blockade the place by erecting a number of forts, bastilles as they were called, watching all its gates. He was unable with his inadequate numbers to erect a complete line of circumvallation. The French made several feeble attempts to save Orleans, of which the best known was that foiled at the Battle of Herrings. A small reinforcement from Paris, guarding a convoy largely composed of salt fish and other Lenten stuff, was attacked near Rouvray by the Dauphin's forces, but parked its waggons in a square and easily beat off the French by the force of archery, February 12, 1429. Nevertheless, Orleans held out stoutly, and Salisbury soon after was killed by a cannon ball as he was reconnoitring its walls. After the Battle of Herrings, Charles seemed to have resigned himself to the prospect of losing Orleans. But in the early spring of 1429 a new factor appeared in the war, and the fortune of the English at last began to wane. Patriotic hearts all over France were deeply stirred by the fact that for 15 years a foreign enemy had been able to overrun and plunder the whole land, owing to the bitter civil strife which divided its inhabitants into two hostile camps. The English were insignificant in numbers, and could not for a moment have maintained themselves but for the fact that a disloyal French faction gave them active aid, while the apathetic majority stood aside and allowed the Dauphinois and the Burgundians to fight out their disreputable blood feud to a miserable end. Meanwhile the countryside lay desolate, the towns were sinking into decay, and the land groaned for a deliverer from the interminable war. Help came from an unexpected quarter. Jeanne d'Arc, a young country girl from Domremy on the borders of Lorraine, had been from her youth a dreamer of dreams and a seer of visions. While her mind was brooding over the misery of her country, she was visited by a series of ecstatic trances in which she believed that her patron saints, the Virgin, Saint Michel, and Saint Catherine, appeared to her and bade her save France by preaching unity to all Frenchmen and setting them an example of vigorous action. After some doubting, she set out to seek the Dauphin's court at Chinon, and presented herself before the apathetic prince, bidding him bestir himself and drive out the English by means of the divine aid which she brought him. Her visions promised her that she should relieve Orleans and lead Charles to Reims, there to crown him king. Convinced by some secret token which Jeanne revealed to him, or perhaps moved only by motives of policy, the Dauphin gave his sanction to her mission, and sent her forth with an expedition which was about to attempt to succour the beleaguered garrison of Orleans. She assumed knightly armour, girt on a sword which was said to have been discovered by a miracle in the church of St. Catherine at Firebois, and bore a white banner. The French leaders were at first inclined to treat her as a mere impostor or fanatic, but the soldiery eagerly accepted her as an emissary of heaven, and went forth with a confidence which they had not shown since Agincourt. She entered Orleans in safety, April 30th, and then led a series of sorties against the English forts which lay around it, heading the storming parties in person. Such was the enthusiasm with which the garrison followed her, that her enterprises were successful, and the besiegers, seeing their line broken, were compelled to raise the leaguer and retire into their nearest strongholds, Jargeau and Beaugency. Rapidly following them up, Jeanne captured both places, and then defeated in the open field at Patay, June 18th, the wrecks of the beaten army, strengthened by a reinforcement from Paris under Lord Talbot. This series of astonishing successes gave the French the confidence which they had so long lacked, while the English, amazed at defeats which they could not understand, declared that Jeanne was a witch and an emissary of the devil. Before her day, wrote a contemporary chronicler, 200 English would drive 500 French before them, but now 200 French would beat and chase 400 English. For the future the offensive was always taken by the Dauphin's troops, and the invaders could only fight on the defensive. After the victory of Patay, the Maid escorted Charles to Reims, as she had promised, and there saw him crowned King of France, July 17th, 1429. After this triumph she begged leave to withdraw home, but her presence was considered too valuable, and she was begged to stay with the army. Yielding to the request, she then advised an instant attack on Paris. It was carried out, but with such slackness and mismanagement that it failed. Joan herself was wounded as she urged on the troops to the storm, and her prestige suffered somewhat from the repulse. But meanwhile Senlis, Beauvais, Laon, and Soissons surrendered to the new king, and as a result of Jeanne's appearance, all Champagne and most of the Île-de-France had been abandoned by the English. Even their hold on Paris and Normandy had been shaken. Next spring the Maid again took the field, though her ungrateful master sent her forth with a very inadequate force at her back. She declared herself that her career was nearing its end, but persevered gallantly in the task which she had undertaken. After some small successes, she threw herself into Compiègne, which was being beleaguered by a Burgundian army. Leading a sally of the garrison to beat up the besiegers' camp, she was unhorsed and taken prisoner. Philip of Burgundy sold her to the English for 10,000 crowns, and she was led into captivity. The Regent Bedford was always reckoned a just and wise prince, but in this case he shamefully belied his reputation. He had no mercy for the limb of the devil, as he called the unfortunate Jeanne. She was for some time held in bonds and subjected to cruel maltreatment in order to induce her to declare that her mission was not from God. Persevering in her belief to the end, she shamed her keepers by her courage and piety. At last Bedford commissioned the Bishop of Beauvais to proceed against her as a witch. After a formal trial before a French ecclesiastical court, she was condemned and burnt to ashes at Rouen on May 30th, 1431. Charles VII was only less guilty than the English in this black business. He made no effort whatever to rescue his saviour, though he had in his hands Lord Talbot and many other English prisoners, and could have stopped Jeanne's persecution at any moment by threatening to retaliate on his captives any judgment that might be passed on her. The Maid died unavenged, but the movement which she had set on foot did not die with her. She had destroyed the self-confidence which had made the English almost invincible. She had also stirred up the heart of the French nation and taught them to forget their wretched factions and feuds. From the moment of her appearance, the Burgundian partisans of the English began one by one to drop off and to make their peace with Charles VII. In spite of all his faults, they saw that he represented the cause of French independence, and that it was a sin to fight against him in the ranks of the invader. Bedford did his best to struggle against fate, and his military talents availed for some years to stem the tide, but he felt himself that he was only postponing the inevitable. The fatal blow was struck when at last Philip of Burgundy consented to forget his father's murder and to make peace with the murderer. At the Congress of Arras he threw up his long alliance with England and reconciled himself to Charles, September 10th, 1435. 4 days later the Regent John of Bedford died at Rouen, worn out by his long campaigning. For 12 years he had hardly been given a moment's rest, and he saw that the ruin of the cause which he had so long maintained was at hand. Bedford had not been buried 7 months when Paris, the last refuge of the English in central France, fell into the hands of the enemy. The burghers, once such hot partisans of Burgundy and England, opened the gates to the besiegers, and Lord Willoughby with his small garrison had to fly in haste, April 1436. Nothing was left now to the English but their old foothold in the Duchy of Guienne, around the ever-loyal Bordeaux, and in the north, Normandy and part of Maine. It is therefore most extraordinary to find that in these limited regions they were able to maintain themselves for no less than 16 years more. The chief heroes of this last and most hopeless stage of the 100 Years' War were John Lord Talbot and Richard Duke of York. The latter was the son of that Richard Earl of Cambridge who had conspired against Henry V in 1415. He had succeeded to the Duchy of York when a young boy on the death of his childless uncle, Duke Edmund, at Agincourt. But he became a much more important personage in 1425, when his other uncle, Edmund Mortimer, Earl of March, died and left him his heir. Through his mother, Anne Mortimer, Richard now represented the eldest line of Edward III's descendants. He was twice appointed to the command in France, and held it from 1435 to 1437, and again from 1441 to 1445. He kept a tight hold on Normandy, beating off assault after assault upon the duchy, and often pushing raids almost to the gates of Paris. He even recovered from the French in 1437 the important fortress of Pontoise, one of the quays of the Seine, and it was maintained until 1441, being 4 times relieved and reprovisioned by the indefatigable Talbot. When York was recalled from France in 1445 and replaced by Edmund Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, a commander of much lower stamp, the power of resistance of the English in Normandy seemed to collapse, and place after place began to fall into the hands of the enemy. Meanwhile, the internal affairs of England present little that is of importance. A long struggle went on between Humphrey of Gloucester, representing the extreme war party, and Beaufort, now a cardinal, who led those who were in favour of coming to an agreement with France, and sacrificing the untenable claim to the French throne in return for some territorial concessions. Gloucester gradually lost ground, more especially after 1441, when his wife, Eleanor Cobham, was prosecuted for using sorcery to compass the king's death, and rightly or wrongly condemned to imprisonment for life. Her husband made no attempt to defend her, but whether from cowardice or from consciousness that she was guilty, it is impossible to tell. The temporary discredit of the war party led to serious negotiations with France in 1444. The king had now attained his majority, and men trusted that a new era would commence when he took over the conduct of affairs from the hands of the council. He himself was set on peace, and it was hoped that the agreement might be sealed by his marriage with a French princess. Unfortunately, however, the son of the heroic Henry V. and the grandson of the politic Henry IV. turned out to be the weakest sovereign that ever sat upon the English throne. A gentle, pious, and capable young man, he was full of good wishes, but lacked the strength to put them into practice. He was so modest and diffident that he was always ready to defer to the opinion of the nearest adviser, but the next person that had his ear could as easily turn him from his first purpose. One unfortunate heritage from his ancestors showed itself in him long ere he reached middle age, a touch of the melancholy madness of his grandfather, Charles VI. of France. When it fell upon him, he had to be placed in retirement, and the cloud did not pass from his brain for many months. He was entirely well-meaning, and his people loved his pious and simple character, but they were at the same time driven to despair by the hopeless incapacity which he showed for affairs of state. Usually he was merely the mouthpiece of those behind the throne. The full extent of Henry's weakness was not yet known, when in 1444 he allowed his minister, William de la Pole, Earl of Suffolk, a partisan of Cardinal Beaufort, to sign the Truce of Tours. By this agreement the English retained their foothold about Bordeaux and in the Duchy of Normandy, but gave up their fortresses in Maine and other outlying regions. At the same time the king received the hand of Margaret of Anjou, a cousin of Charles VII., daughter of René, Duke of Anjou, and titular King of Naples. The terms which Suffolk had obtained were very unfavourable. In return for the ceded strongholds, England should have got something more than an uncertain truce and a dowerless bride for her king. When the details of the Truce of Tours were divulged, Gloucester again raised his head and began to clamour against the cession of Maine. He found plenty of support from the enemies of Suffolk and the Beauforts, and was able to make himself most unpleasant to the young queen. Margaret was a woman of strong passions and considerable ability, who soon learned how to domineer over her meek husband, and was quite reckless in using her power. She threw herself vehemently into English politics as an enemy of Gloucester and his party, and started her career in England as the leader of a faction. At the Parliament of Bury, February 1447, she and Suffolk concocted a coup d'état against Humphrey. He was seized and thrown into prison, where he at once died. There were strong suspicions of foul play, but it seems more likely that apoplexy, caused by a fit of passion, carried off the Duke. His old rival, Cardinal Beaufort, who had retired from politics a few years before, only survived him for 5 weeks. The government of the realm now passed for a space into the hands of Suffolk, the Queen, and Edmund Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, who used the king's name at their pleasure. The leadership of the opposition, on the other hand, had devolved on Richard, Duke of York, a far more able man than Duke Humphrey. He had never forgiven the way in which his career in Normandy had been brought to an end by his being superseded by Somerset. At all costs the ministry should have endeavoured to turn the truce with France into a permanent peace. But they were unable to do so, and what was worse, could not keep their own troops in Normandy in order. A disgraceful raid into Brittany by some mutinous bands whom Somerset had left unpaid gave the French an excuse for renewing the war, March 1449. The best testimony to the incapacity of the English government was the extraordinary rapidity with which Normandy was lost. In less than a year Somerset had been driven out of the duchy which York and Talbot had so long maintained against all the strength of France. A small army of relief sent over from Southampton was cut to pieces at the Battle of Formigny, April 15th, 1450, and 4 months later Cherbourg, the last fortress held by England, lowered its flag. Nothing now remained to England in northern France save the single stronghold of Calais. The outburst of wrath which followed Somerset's disgraceful loss of Normandy marks the opening of a new period in English history. Civil strife was about to be added to foreign war, and the Wars of the Roses were close at hand. End of chapter 11. Chapter 12 of England and the 100 Years' War by Charles William Chadwick Oman. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Pamela Nagami. The Wars of the Roses, 1450 to 1464. Down to the moment of the loss of Normandy, the misfortunes of the French war had provoked no more than a certain amount of clamorous criticism of the king's ministers. The burden of the war had not been very heavily felt. It had been largely maintained with French money, and the parliamentary grants and aid had not been extravagant. The drain of men had been considerable, but it had fallen entirely on volunteers and mercenaries. The hope of conquering all France had long been abandoned, and as long as a broad foothold was kept beyond the Channel, the details of the struggle had not been minutely investigated. It was generally thought that a good deal of mismanagement and maladministration was going on, and grumbling never ceased, but there had as yet been no great explosion of popular wrath. The fact that the opposition was headed by a discredited and reckless busybody like Humphrey of Gloucester had also availed somewhat to weaken its criticism of the ministers. Now, however, matters were changed. The great duchy of Normandy had been lost in a few months, and this disaster fell like a thunderclap on the nation. Moreover, the discontented had now got an able and popular leader in Richard of York, who, as men now began to remember, was very near the throne. Since Gloucester's death, the Duke was the first prince of the blood, and the king's nearest kinsman. Moreover, Henry had now been 5 years wedded, and yet had no offspring. If he continued childless, Richard would inherit his crown. For this reason, both York himself and his admirers were much incensed that, in spite of his well-known ability, he was excluded as far as possible from public affairs. Indeed, he had of late been sent into a kind of honourable banishment by being made Lord Deputy of Ireland, 1448, for a term of 10 years. In the unhappy sister island, he proved to be one of the few successful governors whom England has entrusted with the unenviable post. He and his house were ever after very popular in Ireland. Nor was Richard powerful by reason of his popularity alone. His following among the baronage was very considerable. He himself, through his father's marriage with Anne Mortimer, sister of the last Earl of March, was one of the greatest landholders in the realm. He had wedded Cicely Neville, daughter of the greatest baronial house in the England of that day. Her brother, Richard Neville, Earl of Salisbury, and her nephew, Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, the famous king-maker of a later day, were always the trusty partisans of the Duke. 3 other Neville peers, the Lords Abergavenny, Latimer, and Fauconberg, firmly adhered to the family politics of their race. Another faithful friend was John Mowbray, Duke of Norfolk. He was the nephew of York's wife, Cicely Neville. But his opposition to the king's ministers was probably due rather to an ancient blood feud with the house of Lancaster, for his uncle was the Mowbray who had been beheaded at York in 1405, and his grandfather was the unfortunate opponent of Henry IV in the lists of Coventry. 3 or 4 other houses of minor note were allied with the Nevilles and Mowbrays, and the whole group constituted a faction of formidable strength. The baronage of England had been dwindling in numbers for a century and more. There were now not more than 30 or 40 lay peers in the House of Lords. Each of the titles of the year 1450 represented 3 or 4 of the old baronies of the time of the Edwards. Hence a compact group of 12 peers now comprised 1/3 of the whole baronage of England. The estates of Mortimer, Mowbray, and Neville were scattered thickly all over England, and gave rallying points in almost every county for the partisans of York. There is no proof whatever that Duke Richard had personally dabbled in treasonable schemes before he had been banished to Ireland by the king's ministers. His conduct all through Henry's minority had been loyal and correct. It seems that he was first roused to action by the clamours of the nation, and only moved when public opinion demanded that he should take his proper place in the state and exert the influence to which he was entitled as first prince of the blood. Had King Henry been a man of ability, who could rule his ministers instead of being ruled by them, there seems no reason to think that Duke Richard would have stirred. All through his life he was a man of cautious and moderate measures, but he would have been more than human if he had refrained from using his strength when he was shouldered aside and ignored by the faction led by the Beauforts, Suffolk, and Queen Margaret. The loss of Normandy was followed by the first popular outbreak in England which had been seen for more than a generation. It was directed against the king's ministers and advisers, and appeared all over the southern shires. Already, before Formigny had been fought, a mob of mutinous soldiers had stoned to death Bishop Malins, the keeper of the Privy Seal, at Portsmouth, January 1450. 2 months later, such a bitter outcry in Parliament was raised against Suffolk that after he had been impeached, the timid king ordered him to leave the realm for the present. He took ship for Flanders, but was waylaid on the high seas by some vessels from London, and was murdered by the sailors. Who was at the bottom of this act of piracy was never discovered. May 2nd, 1450. If the Queen and Somerset hoped that the unpopularity of the ministry might end with Suffolk's fall, they were soon undeceived. The populace was still unsatisfied. In the month of June, troubles broke out in many places. Askew, Bishop of Salisbury, the king's confessor, was slain by rioters in his own diocese. There were risings in Sussex and Norfolk also, but the main focus of trouble lay in Kent. It was fomented by a certain John Elmer or Cade, a soldier of fortune, who had served under York both in France and Ireland. He assumed the name of Mortimer, stated that he was a distant relative of Duke Richard, and pretended that he was acting in his interests. With a great mob of Kentishmen at his back, he entered London, July 3rd, 1450, after beating the hasty levies which the ministers sent out against him. The Londoners joined him, and for a few days he was master of the streets. He used his power to execute Lord Say, the treasurer, and Cromer, sheriff of Kent, the chief officials who fell into his power. But Cade soon proved unable to keep his followers in hand. They fell to plundering, and so frightened the citizens that many of them took arms and aided the garrison of the Tower in driving the insurgents out of the city. On being promised a pardon, the Kentishmen dispersed, but their leader, refusing to disarm, was hunted down and slain. Meanwhile, Richard of York, hearing of the tumults in England, had left his post at Dublin and crossed St. George's Channel. When he came to land, many of his followers flocked to join him, and it seemed likely that a new civil war might break out. But the Duke contented himself with issuing manifestoes against the ministry and setting on his partisans in Parliament to attack them. The Yorkist majority in the House of Commons tendered to the king a petition begging him to dismiss Somerset and his friends, but Henry was entirely in the hands of the Beauforts and refused to listen to it. When Thomas Young, member for Bristol, spoke of the Duke as rightful heir to the crown, he was sent to the Tower. York still held back from violent measures, but if anything was yet wanting to complete Somerset's discredit with the nation, it was the result of the next year's campaign in France. In 1451 the French threw themselves upon Aquitaine, which the government had wholly neglected during the domestic troubles. The Gascons did their best, but one after another all their cities fell before the French artillery. Bordeaux yielded in June and Bayonne in October, without having received any succour from England. Only Calais now remained unconquered of all the broad domain which Henry VI had inherited on the continent. The loss of Aquitaine at last drove York to desperation. Raising his own retainers and those of the Nevilles and Mowbrays, he marched on London. The king, at the head of a larger force, faced him at Dartford in Kent, and there at a conference Henry promised to dismiss his present advisers and change his methods of governance. But when York had disbanded his army, Somerset appeared again at the king's right hand, and Duke Richard found that he had been tricked. March 1452. He was arrested and only released after pledging himself never again to take arms. This promise he kept, under circumstances of great provocation, for the next 3 years, from 1452 to 1455. Meanwhile, the last campaign of the 100 Years' War was about to begin. The Gascons, sincerely attached to the English connection and oppressed by their new French governors, burst out into insurrection in the summer of 1452. To aid them, Lord Talbot, now Earl of Shrewsbury, came over from England at the head of 4,000 or 5,000 men. Aided by the insurgents, he recovered Bordeaux and all the lands around it, and during the winter of 1452-3 held his own with ease. But when summer came round, the whole national levy of France marched into Aquitaine and laid siege to Castillon. Hurrying up to rescue it, the brave old earl resolved to storm the French lines of circumvallation. Forming his men in a deep column, contrary to the English custom, he launched them at the entrenchments. But the hostile artillery blew the head of the mass to pieces, Talbot himself was slain, and after a hard struggle the English and Gascons were cut to pieces, July 17th, 1453. This battle settled the fate of Aquitaine, for Somerset could not or would not send out further succours, and Bordeaux capitulated in October, after holding out gallantly for 10 weeks. A few days after the Battle of Castillon, and long before it could have been known in England, King Henry fell for the first time into a fit of madness, the result, it is said, of a sudden fright. For 18 months he remained in a state of melancholy apathy, or rather idiocy, and was unable to discharge the simplest functions of royalty. This was in many ways the best thing for England that could have happened, and many years of trouble would have been avoided if he had never recovered. After a space, Parliament met and appointed Duke Richard Protector of the realm, while Somerset was sent to the Tower. But some 3 months after her husband had gone mad, the Queen, after 9 years of childless wedlock, gave birth to a son, a circumstance which changed the aspect of politics by cutting York out of the line of succession to the throne. He behaved, however, with correctness and moderation, acknowledged the infant prince as heir to the crown, and did homage to him. He acted as regent for more than a year, and did his best to bring the internal affairs of the kingdom into order. For the French war nothing could be done. With the second fall of Bordeaux, all hope of retaining a foothold in Aquitaine had vanished. About midwinter 1454 and 5, King Henry suddenly recovered his senses. The moment that he was convalescent, his wife induced him to release Somerset from prison, and a few weeks later York and his friends were dismissed from all their offices, which were given back to the Beauforts and their partisans. A Parliament was then summoned to meet at Leicester, which was to reverse all the acts of the Protectorate. Now at last Duke Richard lost his temper, and took arms at the head of his faction, after issuing a manifesto which denounced Somerset not only as a minister of tried incapacity, but as a perjured traitor. The king, with a considerable armed following, was moving from London towards the Midlands, when the Duke and his partisans fell upon him at St. Albans. There was a short but sharp fray in the streets, which ended in the victory of the Yorkists, due mainly to the hard fighting of the younger Richard Neville, the Earl of Warwick, who first broke through the Lancastrian barricades. Somerset was slain, and with him several peers of his faction. The king fell into the hands of the victors, May 22nd, 1455. This insignificant skirmish, in which neither side had more than 2,000 men present, cost the lives of only a few scores of fighting men. But it was to be the prelude of a war of the most desperate and bloody kind, which was to mow down half the baronage of England. It came to be known as the War of the Roses, from the white rose which was the badge of the House of York, and the red rose which was afterwards assumed as the token of the House of Lancaster. At first it seemed possible that the Battle of St. Albans might lead to a mere change of ministry, much desired by the majority of the nation. Duke Richard treated the captive king with all respect, and merely reinstated himself and his friends in power. The excitement of the battle had thrown Henry back into his melancholy madness, in which he lay for some months incapable of all action. The Duke's term of power, however, lasted little more than a year. In October 1456, the king, having recovered his senses once more, fell under the influence of his wife, who now put herself openly forward as head of the Loyalist faction in place of Somerset. By her advice the Yorkists were removed from office. 3 years of unrest and bickering followed, from 1456 to 1459, before matters again came to a head. Each party, meanwhile, was preparing for the inevitable strife. The bloodshed at St. Albans had made reconciliation impossible, and it was felt that the next struggle must lead to the extermination of one party or the other. Duke Richard saw that it would not avail him to attain once more to office, if he was always liable to be dismissed from it at the Queen's pleasure. When forced to take up arms again, he must make his position secure. Margaret, on the other hand, was conscious that if she failed in the oncoming struggle, the succession of her little son to his father's throne would be more than problematical. She was resolved to fight to the death for his rights, and spent all her time and energy in binding into a compact Lancastrian party those of the baronage who were not allied by blood or ancient friendship with the houses of York, Neville, and Mowbray. Beside the Beaufort clan, now headed by Henry, son of the Somerset who had fallen at St. Albans, she could count on the support of the Percys, old rivals of the Nevilles in the north, of the Courtenays, Earls of Devon in the west, of the Dukes of Buckingham and Exeter, and the Earls of Oxford and Shrewsbury, and of a body of barons decidedly more numerous than those who followed Duke Richard, though not individually so powerful. All through 1458 both Yorkists and Lancastrians had been secretly arming for a new trial of strength. In the summer of 1459 the Queen began to issue writs in her husband's name, bidding her partisans to be ready to turn out in arms at a moment's notice. It was this fact, followed by a peremptory summons to the Yorkist leaders to present themselves before the king in person, which seems to have provoked the final outburst. In September, Duke Richard raised his standard in the Mortimer lands on the Welsh border, while Salisbury called out the Neville tenants in the North Riding, and the young Earl of Warwick hurried over from Calais to join his father. The two Nevilles made their way to the west to join their kinsman Warwick without difficulty, but Salisbury only after a sharp fight with the Loyalists of Cheshire and Staffordshire, on whom he inflicted a bloody check at Blore Heath. But the numerous supporters of York in London and the eastern counties had no time to join their chief before the fate of the campaign was settled. The king, showing for once in his life both energy and decision, had placed himself at the head of the levies of central England and marched on Ludlow, where the insurgents lay. Their armies faced each other at Ludford across the flooded Teme, and a battle on a large scale seemed imminent, but the Duke's partisans saw that they were much outnumbered, and many of them felt scruples at resisting their sovereign when he personally led his army to attack them. This time it was no question of opposing a Suffolk or a Somerset. The king himself, and not merely the king's name, was arrayed against them. When Henry and his host passed the Teme and advanced on the Yorkist camp, the insurgents melted away before his face without fighting, and the Lancastrians were victorious without striking a blow. Duke Richard escaped to Ireland, where he found a warm welcome. The two Neville earls escaped in a fishing smack to Calais, where the garrison was devoted to Warwick, who had long been their governor, October 1459. The rout of Ludford placed the Queen in a triumphant position. The Yorkists had put themselves in the wrong by their armed rebellion, and it would have been easy to crush them in their two last strongholds. But Margaret showed herself an incompetent ruler. Instead of making a vigorous attempt to end the war, she set to work to proscribe and punish her enemies before they were completely disposed of. The Duke and his chief followers were attainted, their lands were confiscated, some of their minor adherents were executed, but no assault in strength was made on Calais or on Ireland. The Yorkist party had time to recover from its panic, and the nation was shocked by the Queen's violent actions. The most unwise of them was that she had allowed the open town of Newbury to be sacked merely because it belonged to the Duke. In June of 1460, Warwick, who showed himself throughout the leading spirit in the Yorkist ranks, landed at Sandwich with a few hundred followers from Calais. The Kentish men at once rose in arms to aid him. The Londoners opened their gates to him, though a royalist garrison maintained itself in the Tower, and Archbishop Borcher, a cousin of York, brought the levies of the eastern counties to his aid. The Queen, taken by surprise, had called together her partisans from the Midland shires at Northampton, where they palisaded a strong entrenched camp. But Warwick hurried forward from London, stormed the fortifications, and routed the Lancastrians. King Henry was taken prisoner, while the captains of his host, the Duke of Buckingham and the Earl of Shrewsbury, were slain. July 10th, 1460. The Queen and her young son escaped to the north, where they took refuge with the Earl of Northumberland. Duke Richard arrived from Ireland too late to take part in his nephew's victory, and found the greater part of the realm at his feet. He called together a parliament, in which hot disputes broke out among his partisans as to the way in which the governance of the realm should be arranged. Twice already the plan of retaining King Henry on the throne and making York protector had been tried and had failed. Many of the Duke's advisers were of opinion that he might now set aside Henry and declare himself king. There was no doubt that from the point of view of strict hereditary right, the heir of the house of March and Clarence had a better title than the heir of Lancaster. Richard himself leaned to this alternative, but Warwick and the Nevilles were for a less violent change. They thought that Richard should be proclaimed protector for life and heir to the throne, while Henry should be allowed to reign in name so long as he lived. Personally, the pious king was not unpopular, and no one wished him ill, but it was necessary to disinherit his young son Edward in order that Queen Margaret might never again interfere in politics. This alternative was ultimately adopted. It bears a strong resemblance to the scheme formulated at the Treaty of Troyes in respect to the crown of France. York, being named protector for life, had now to subdue the parts of the realm where his title was not acknowledged. He sent against Wales, where the two Tudors, Jasper and Owen, step-brother and step-father of King Henry, were in arms. Footnote: some years after the death of Henry V, his widow, Catherine of France, had wedded Owen Tudor, a plain Welsh gentleman. Her 2 sons by him, Edmund and Jasper, were made Earls of Richmond and Pembroke by their half-brother, the king. The former, who died young, was the father of Henry VII. His eldest son, Edward, Earl of March, a young man of 18, who had seen his first service in the field of Northampton. He himself and his brother-in-law, Richard Neville, Earl of Salisbury, marched into the north. There the Lancastrian interest was very strong. Indeed, the Yorkists had little influence north of the Humber, save in the Neville estates and the North Riding. The Queen, the young Duke of Somerset, and the Percys had raised a considerable army and were bent on fighting. York, undervaluing their numbers and overestimating the extent to which they had been demoralized by the defeat of Northampton, rashly engaged with them at Wakefield, though his forces amounted to only a third of theirs. He was surrounded and cut to pieces with the whole of his army. The Earl of Salisbury and Edmund of York, Richard's second son, a lad of 16, were captured and put to death in cold blood by the victors. Their heads, with that of the Duke himself, were struck off and placed on spikes over the gate of York, December 30th, 1460. This murder of prisoners and mutilation of the dead was by far the worst outrage which had yet happened in the struggle. It embittered the civil war into a blood feud and made the heirs of York and Salisbury pitiless for the future. Hitherto they had given quarter, but now they had the death and dishonour of their fathers to avenge. A change for the worse is at once visible in their action. After the victory of Wakefield, the Lancastrians flocked in from all sides to join the Queen, and she was able to march on London at the head of a formidable host. The task of opposing her fell on Warwick, who, by the deaths of his father and uncle, had become the undisputed head of his party, Edward of March being as yet young and little known. Warwick arrayed the Yorkists of London, Kent, and the eastern counties at St. Albans, and there awaited the hostile attack. It was delivered with great vigour on February 17th, 1461, and once more the Queen was victorious. Treachery or chance left a gap in the Earl's line through which the Lancastrians penetrated, and the routed host was pushed westward in its flight, leaving the road to London open. The King was recaptured by his friends, and his wife celebrated his deliverance by executing the 2 chief Yorkist prisoners who fell into her hands. The fall of London now seemed so sure that the victorious Lancastrians spent 8 days in settling the terms of capitulation at their leisure. This delay proved their ruin and saved the capital. Edward of March had now beaten the Welsh levies of the Tudors at the Battle of Mortimer's Cross, February 2nd, 1461, and was already on the march for London when the news of the disaster at St. Albans reached him. At Chipping Norton, Warwick joined him with the wrecks of his beaten host, and after a short conference they agreed to move on the capital and throw themselves into it, if it were not already in the enemy's power. By a forced march they reached it on the very day when it was to have been surrendered to the Queen, February 26. The sudden arrival of 12,000 Yorkists within the walls changed the aspect of affairs, and the Londoners resolved to hold out. Margaret and her generals were not prepared for a siege. Their army was discontented at being denied the sack of London, and was already beginning to melt home with the plunder which it had gathered in the home counties. After some hesitation, the Lancastrians determined to retire northward to gather reinforcements and to throw the dangers of the offensive on their enemies. As they moved backward along the road to York, they ravaged the country around in the most shameful manner. It was this misbehaviour of the northern moss troopers which mainly accounts for the sudden vehemence with which the Midlands now took up the cause of York. Hitherto they had been but lukewarm, but smarting under their losses, they turned out in great force to join Edward of March and Richard of Warwick. The former, before starting on the campaign, was saluted by his followers as king under the name of Edward IV. He claimed the crown as heir of Lionel of Clarence, ignoring the Lancastrian usurpation and dating his reign from March 1461, though his title did not receive parliamentary sanction until November. Thus with him triumphed the cause of hereditary right, as opposed to that theory of election by the nation represented in Parliament, under which the Lancastrian house had held the throne. Allowing only a few days of rest to their army, Warwick and King Edward followed the Lancastrians towards York, gathering up on their way numerous levies from the eastern and midland shires. On March 28th the enemy was found lying behind the river Aire. After driving in his rear guard by a skirmish at Ferrybridge, the Yorkists crossed the stream and came upon the Queen's host drawn up on the hillside of Towton. Next day, Palm Sunday, March 29th, 1461, the bloodiest battle of the War of the Roses was fought. Both sides were in great force, and contemporary writers thought that as many as 60,000 Lancastrians and 45,000 Yorkists were engaged, figures that cannot be trusted for a moment. In a blinding snowstorm the Yorkists climbed the hillside and ranged themselves opposite their foes. After a preliminary discharge of arrows, the hosts clashed together all along the line, and remained locked together for many hours of close fighting with sword and axe. Toward evening a flank attack made by the Duke of Norfolk settled the result of the battle, and the Queen's army turned to fly. Besides those who fell in the pursuit, great numbers were drowned in the flooded stream of the Cock, which lay just behind their position. The slaughter was very great, especially among the barons and knights, who could not easily fly in their heavy mail. The Earl of Northumberland and 4 other peers were slain. The Earls of Devon and Wiltshire, and a great number of knights and squires captured in the pursuit, were beheaded in revenge for the slaying of Salisbury and Prince Edmund after Wakefield. The Queen, with her husband and her young son, fled from York into Scotland the moment that the result of the battle was known. With them went the young Duke of Somerset, almost the only Lancastrian of note who escaped from the field alive. The party was crushed beyond hope of recovery, and though its desperate partisans held out for nearly 3 years more in Wales and on the Scottish border, they were never able to shake the power of the new king. Indeed, England south of the Tees was free from civil war from the day of Towton onwards. The lingering struggle in Northumberland was only sustained by 2 supports, the Queen's untiring energy and the desperate hatred for the Neville's which filled the hearts of the Percys and the other nobles of the north. Margaret bought aid from Scotland by ceding Berwick to King James III. She crossed to France and wrung money and auxiliaries from the stingy Louis XI by promising to give over Calais to him. But all her efforts came to naught. The great Northumbrian fortresses of Alnwick and Bamborough were taken by the Earl of Warwick in 1462. By the aid of her French troops she recovered them for a moment, but this success was only to lead to a second disaster. Warwick returned and blew the great northern strongholds to pieces with his artillery, 1463. The Scots grew tired of the war. King Louis would give no more aid when he found that Calais was not likely to come into his hands. The final desperate rally of the northern Lancastrians was crushed at the fights of Hedgeley Moor, April 15th, and Hexham, May 13th, 1464. After this victory, the few surviving chiefs of the Loyalists fell into Warwick's hands, and when he had beheaded the Duke of Somerset and the Lords Roos and Hungerford, the long resistance collapsed for lack of leaders. At last there was no man left in England who did not bow his head before King Edward and his great vice-regent, Richard Neville. King Henry himself, wandering hopelessly in disguise through the realm that had once been his own, was captured and consigned to the Tower, where he lingered for 6 years in pious melancholy. End of chapter 12. Chapter 13 of England and the 100 Years' War by Charles William Chadwick Oman. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Pamela Nagami. Richard the Kingmaker and Edward the King, 1464 to 1483. While the struggle with the last survivors of the Lancastrian faction was still in progress, the governance of England had been in the hands of the Neville clan. Richard of Warwick, the Kingmaker, the head of the house, and by far its most able representative, had been continually in the field as the leader of King Edward's armies. George Neville, Archbishop of York, Warwick's brother, was Chancellor. John Neville, Lord Montague, another brother, was regarded as the king's confidential counsellor. He had also commanded at Hexham and Hedgeley Moor. William Neville, Lord Falkenberg, had been made Earl of Kent for his services at Towton, and several other members of the family were high in place about the king. The house and its connections had formed the backbone of the Yorkist party, and its members thought themselves entitled to good payment for their services. If Edward IV. Had been a weak ruler, the domination of the Nevilles might have continued all through his reign. But the young king was far from being a nonentity. He was able, obstinate, selfish, and ungrateful, the last of men to suffer himself to be made the tool of his mother's relations. As long as the Lancastrians still made head against him, he was content to use the services of Warwick and his brothers, but now that his throne was safe, he intended to rule after his own will and inclination. He was quite competent to do so. At Mortimer's Cross and Towton he had already shown that he was a good soldier. He had a clear head, a hard heart, and no scruples. His weak point was a love of pleasure and debauchery, which sometimes led him to waste his time in idleness. But when prompt and decisive action was required, he always shed his sloth and set to work with an energy and ability which startled his enemies. The first rift between the king and the Nevilles appeared in the year 1464, just after the last hopes of the Lancastrians had been crushed at Hexham. The king was now 23, and it was high time for him to wed. With his apparent consent, Warwick commenced a negotiation for his marriage with the sister of the Queen of France. The Neville foreign policy had always been to ally England to France, and to distrust the king of France's rival, Charles the Rash, the great Duke of Burgundy. Suddenly Edward announced that the French match must be dropped because he was married already. He had become infatuated with a beautiful widow 7 years older than himself. Elizabeth Woodville was the daughter of Lord Rivers, a Lancastrian peer, and her first husband, Sir John Grey, another prominent Lancastrian, had fallen at St. Albans. Caring nothing for the disparity of rank, nor for the disloyal traditions of Elizabeth's family, Edward had secretly married her and kept the matter dark for 6 months, between May and October of 1464. When he vouchsafed to declare what he had done, Warwick had at once to abandon his negotiations with Louis XI, and was much displeased at the manner in which he had been tricked. The king soon began to display an exaggerated fondness for his wife's numerous relations, to place them about his person, and to seek wealthy marriages for them. We cannot doubt that his conduct was dictated by policy, and not by a real regard for the Woodvilles and Greys, who were a greedy and grasping crew. He wished to surround himself with persons entirely dependent on his favour, as a check on the haughty and self-reliant Neville clan. For the same reason he created a number of new peers to counterbalance the Neville family group in the House of Lords. For 2 years there was no open breach between Edward and Warwick, but in June of 1467 the king dismissed George Neville, the Chancellor, openly disavowed Warwick and his policy, and put himself entirely in the hands of his new friends. His change of views was completed by the formation of an alliance with the Duke of Burgundy, to whom he gave his sister Margaret in marriage. To break so rudely and openly with the Nevilles was unwise. The family was powerful in nearly every part of England, and Warwick had been for so long the figurehead of the Yorkist party that most of its older members looked to him and not to the king for guidance. Moreover, the Woodvilles were making themselves hated for their pride and shameless greed. A typical instance of their conduct was the marriage of young John Woodville, the Queen's brother, to the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk, who was old enough to have been his grandmother, but possessed wealth enough to tempt him into the match. Noting the unpopularity which was gathering around Edward, Warwick began to make quiet preparations for resuming his old position, even though he might have to use force in the process. He enlisted in his cause the king's brother, George, Duke of Clarence, an ambitious and discontented young man, by giving him the hand of his eldest daughter, Isabel Neville, on whom, since the great earl had no male issue, the larger half of his vast estates would some day devolve. In July of 1469, thinking matters ripe for his interference, Warwick set his followers to work. His nephew, Sir Henry Fitzhugh, and his cousin, Sir Henry Neville, took arms in Yorkshire with a programme much like that which the Lords Appellant had used against Richard II, or the early Yorkists against Suffolk and Somerset. The king must be freed from unworthy favourites, and provided with a respectable and responsible ministry, that is, replaced in his former dependence on the house of Neville. This rising is often called the Rebellion of Robin of Redesdale, an assumed name adopted by one of its leaders, Sir John Conyers. Warwick had passed the word around among his friends and adherents to support the rising, but did not appear himself. Soon the rebel army swelled to formidable proportions, moved south, and routed the troops which the king sent against them under the Earls of Pembroke and Devon. At Edgecote Field, near Banbury, Edward, after the battle, saw his army disperse and fell into the hands of the rebels. Warwick and Clarence then appeared upon the scene and assumed the custody of the king's person. Edward was treated with formal courtesy, but placed for a time in safe keeping at Middleham Castle, a Neville stronghold in Yorkshire. His favourites fared much worse. The Queen's father, Rivers, her brother, John Woodville, and the Earls of Devon and Pembroke were all beheaded by the rebels with Warwick's full approval. Greedy upstarts as they were, they did not deserve to die without a trial, and their bloody end shocked the whole Yorkist party. After keeping the king 2 months under restraint, from August to September 1469, Warwick released him, thinking that he had been taught the necessary lesson and would for the future refrain from offending the Neville clan. As a matter of fact, Edward's spirit was not broken, and his only thought was to revenge himself on the Earl and Clarence. 6 months later he got his opportunity. A Lancastrian insurrection broke out in Lincolnshire in March of 1470, and to suppress it the king gathered a large army, whose leaders were carefully chosen from among the enemies of the Nevilles. After dispersing the rebels near Stamford in a fight often called Losecoat Field, the king suddenly wheeled about and marched against Warwick and Clarence, who were coming from Coventry to join him with a small force. He was resolved to treat them just as they had treated him in the preceding year. Having caught them unprepared, he hunted them across England and finally forced them to embark at Dartmouth and flee to France, March 1470. The great earl had fallen so easily because he had not been granted time to call together his numerous adherents. If the king had lingered, Warwick's expulsion would have cost him much heavy fighting. He was now master of his realm again, but not for long. His enemy was bent on revenge, and had made up his mind to forget all his old grudges against Margaret of Anjou and the Lancastrians. At the court of Louis XI, the earl met the exiled queen and made his peace with her. They agreed to join their forces in order to crush Edward IV, and Warwick undertook to replace Henry VI on the throne. As a pledge of reconciliation, his younger daughter, Anne Neville, was betrothed to Prince Edward, the heir of the Lancastrian house. Warwick soon set to work to use all his powers of intrigue. His emissaries overran the whole of England, bidding his partisans to be prepared for a rising in the autumn, while Queen Margaret sent similar warnings to the survivors of her party. In September the plot had been prepared. Lord Fitzhugh, a brother-in-law of Warwick, got up an unimportant rising in the north to attract the king's attention. Edward took the bait, and when he had reached York, the earl slipped across the Channel and raised his banner in Devonshire, a district where the Lancastrian party was strong. When the signal was given, the retainers of the Neville's rose in arms in every shire, and the king had to turn southward. He had only reached Nottingham when he found that Warwick's brother Montague had led over to the enemy the whole of the levies of the Midlands, which had been gathered together to resist the invasion. The king's own soldiery began to melt away from him, and in despair he rowed hard for the coast and took ship at Lynn with his young brother Richard, Duke of Gloucester, Lord Hastings, and a few scores of faithful followers. He reached the Netherlands in safety, and was kindly received by Charles the Rash, his brother-in-law. The Duke of Burgundy was anxious to oblige any enemy of his old foe, Louis XI. of France. The power of the Nevilles had been vindicated, and Warwick might indeed call himself the king-maker when he drew Henry VI. From his prison in the Tower and replaced him on his long-lost throne. Edward had been beaten without a blow struck, and his wife and young daughters were at the earl's mercy as hostages. He did not, however, disturb them when they took sanctuary at Westminster. The position of the conqueror was a difficult one. He was distrusted by the Lancastrians, and himself distrusted them. Clarence, his chief supporter, was discontented at the restoration of the old king. He had hoped that his father-in-law would have given him the crown, instead of replacing it on the head of Henry. Edward was known to have many partisans, but how many no one could say, since they had been given no opportunity of displaying themselves. Meanwhile a ministry, partly composed of Warwick's friends, partly of Lancastrians, was put in power, and for the moment all was quiet. Queen Margaret and her son very unwisely lingered in France. They should have crossed the Channel when their party had triumphed. In March 1471 came the last development of the long strife between the king-maker and his former master. Edward IV. was furnished with 50,000 florins and 1,200 mercenaries by the Duke of Burgundy, and sailed forth from Holland to try his fortune once more. He landed in Yorkshire, giving out at first that he was only come to claim his father's duchy, and did not ask for the crown or intend civil war. By the inexcusable carelessness of Montague, who was commanding in the north, he was allowed to slip across the Trent and to reach Leicester, where a considerable body of his partisans joined him. It seemed probable, however, that he would soon be crushed by numbers, for hostile forces began to close around him on all sides, and Warwick himself advanced to Coventry, which had been appointed as the mustering place of his host. From this rather desperate position Edward was rescued by the treachery of his brother George of Clarence. The Duke had been commissioned to raise the Western Midlands in King Henry's name, but when he approached Coventry he swerved aside and joined the invaders with 7,000 or 8,000 men. This made Edward so strong that Warwick could not fight him until he had received reinforcements. While the earl was waiting, his adversary made a desperate dash for London, and was admitted within its walls by a sudden rising of its partisans, April 11, 1471. But Warwick was now close at his heels with all his host, and till he was beaten off nothing had really been secured. Accordingly the Yorkists marched out and met their pursuers at Barnet, where on April 14th a desperate battle took place. It was fought in a dense fog, a circumstance which proved fatal to the great earl, for 2 corps of his army mistook each other for enemies and came to blows. When they recognized each other, each thought the other had deserted to the king, and both cried treachery and fled. The remainder of the king-maker's men stood their ground, but were overwhelmed by numbers and cut to pieces. Warwick himself and his brother Montague were both left dead upon the field. On the very day of Barnet, Queen Margaret and her son landed at Weymouth, and put themselves at the head of an army which the Beauforts had gathered in Somerset and Devon. Hearing of Warwick's defeat and death, they resolved to make their way toward Wales, a great Lancastrian stronghold. But by a forced march King Edward threw himself across their path, and forced them to fight at Tewkesbury, with the unfordable Severn at their backs. After a hard struggle the Lancastrians were beaten from their position, and all who could not fly fast were slain, captured, or driven into the river. the young Prince Edward was killed as he cried in vain for quarter, and called on the name of his brother Clarence. With him fell the Earl of Devon and Lord Wenlock. Edmund, the last Duke of Somerset of the Beaufort line, was captured and executed with 10 other prisoners of rank, May 4th, 1471. Queen Margaret also fell into the victors' hands. Her life was spared, but with a perfectly gratuitous cruelty Edward ordered her harmless husband to be secretly put to death in the Tower. Now that his only son was dead, Henry was no longer valuable as a hostage, and was made away with. His murderer gave out that he died of pure displeasure and melancholy. So ended in one common disaster the dynasty of Lancaster and the great house of Neville. The male line of John of Gaunt was extinct. The female line was only represented by the King of Portugal and the Queen of Castile, who descended from 2 of his daughters, and by the Lady Margaret Beaufort, the last of the Somersets. She had a son by her first husband, Edmund Tudor, Earl of Richmond, and this young boy was one day to reign under the name of Henry VII. The vast estates of Warwick were divided between his 2 daughters, the Duchess of Clarence and the Princess Anne, the widow of Prince Edward. The latter was forced to marry the king's youngest brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, so that all the broad Neville, Montacute, and Beauchamp lands passed into the hands of the royal family. Edward had yet 12 years to reign. They contrast strongly with the troublous times between 1460 and 1471, for their annals are lacking in interest and incident. The king was strong-handed enough to rule as he pleased, and might have become a tyrant had he been more restless and energetic. But habits of sloth grew upon him, and he wasted much of his time on pleasures lawful and unlawful, and on riotous living. Before he was 40 he had ruined his constitution, and had grown grossly corpulent and unwieldy. His rule was far more autocratic than that of the Lancastrian house. Between 1478 and 1483 he did not call Parliament together, and he often indulged in the unconstitutional practice of raising benevolences or forced loans not sanctioned by parliamentary authority. But he can hardly be called an oppressive ruler. His arbitrary acts did not affect the bulk of his subjects, and his financial exactions were moderate, for he was much wealthier than his predecessors, owing to the vast amounts of confiscated land belonging to the followers of Lancaster and Warwick which had fallen into his hands. After 1475 he had another source of revenue. In alliance with Charles of Burgundy he invaded France and advanced as far as Péronne in Picardy. But the wily Louis XI offered to buy him off by paying down a great sum of money and guaranteeing him an annual pension as long as peace should endure. Edward threw over his ally and greedily closed with the offer. By the Treaty of Pecquigny, 13th of August 1475, he received 75,000 gold crowns in ready money, 50,000 more as a ransom for the unfortunate Margaret of Anjou, and the guarantees for the payment of 50,000 crowns per annum as long as he should live. He at once retired from France, and for the rest of his life was paid the subsidy with great regularity. The main anxiety of Edward during these years arose from the discontent of his brother George of Clarence. The treachery of the Duke in the years 1469 and 70 could never be forgotten, and the king always viewed him with suspicion. Clarence did his best to justify these doubts. His behaviour was captious, insolent, and overbearing. In 1477 he provoked Edward to great wrath by putting to death on his own authority and without a proper trial a lady named Anchoret Twindo, whom he accused of having caused by sorcery the death of his wife, the Duchess Isabel. On another occasion he tried to marry Margaret, the heiress of Burgundy, without Edward's leave. In 1478 the brothers had a violent quarrel about the arrest and execution of some of Clarence's followers for treason. It ended in the Duke's being sent to the Tower. Soon after, Edward called together a Parliament, and accused his brother in person before the peers. Clarence was, he said, incorrigible, and he would not be answerable for the weal, public peace, and tranquillity of the realm if such loathly offences should be pardoned. The Lords could do no less than find the accused guilty, when the king acted as prosecutor. A fortnight later, a false, fleeting, perjured Clarence was put to death in the Tower. A tradition dating back to the very year of his execution declares that he was drowned in a butt of Malmsey wine, but nothing is really known of the details of his end. Edward survived his brother for 5 years. His health was steadily growing worse, but he made no attempt to break himself of his evil habits, and as he became less fit for business, handed over much of the conduct of affairs to his youngest brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, and his chamberlain, Lord Hastings, the 2 faithful partisans who had never shrunk from his side in all the troubles of the evil days in 1469-71. The last important event in the reign was a short war with Scotland in 1482, caused partly by the raids of the moss troopers of the border into Northumberland, partly by the intrigues of the exiled Duke of Albany, who stirred up England against his brother James III for his own private ends. Gloucester held the command since the king was too ill to take the field, and distinguished himself by retaking Berwick, which had been held by the Scots since Margaret of Anjou made it over to them in 1461. He ravaged the Lowlands till the Scottish king sued for peace, but the negotiations were still unfinished when news came that King Edward was dead. Though only in his 42nd year, his constitution was worn out, and he succumbed to an attack of ague of no special virulence. March 30th, 1483. Thoroughly selfish, cruel, and debauched, he was one of the worst men who have sat on the English throne, but it cannot be said that he was an inefficient ruler. The country was not unprosperous under his hand, in spite of all the wars and rumours of wars which had passed over it. The nobles and their retainers had been thinned by the sword and axe, but the storm had passed far above the heads of the majority of the nation. Taxation was light, trade and commerce were not unprosperous. England, in short, has seen much worse days under much better kings. End of chapter 13.